want you to think back to the first time you ever remember being truly afraid. What was it? Does it stick with you today? This is the sort of thing that we talk about on the House of Asher. Won't you join us? The House of Asher, a clearinghouse for the mind. And welcome to a new episode of House of Asher. I am your host, Steve Asher. As always, that works out real well, so it doesn't confuse people. We are listening to episode 39, and what's super cool about this, well, there's a lot of stuff that's super cool about the next guy we're getting ready to talk to, our guest. Growing up and kind of listening to a lot of AM radio and hearing a lot of talk radio and stuff growing up as a kid, coming up to the 70s and stuff, I was always intrigued by the late night shows, and as time went on, Mr. Art Bell coming to the scene, and so of course he brought his own brand of weirdness and strangeness and all that to it. And I remember Art, who's now gone, and but before all that happened, he had different incarnations and different startups here and there. And one of the things he had was the Dark Matter show. And I had heard a guest recently, and I'm not sure how I haven't heard this before. I guess I must have missed this episode some which way. But this next guest has seen a lot of really oddball stuff, and what's so funny is that, at least in my surmises, that he's never went heavy-handed with it. He never went goofy, campy with it. It was just kind of like, look, this is what it is. Take it for what it's worth. This is what I've encountered, and he has encountered a lot beyond the initial things that he saw. He's had different contacts with different governmental bodies, which we'll definitely get into. But I want to introduce this time Jeremy Meador. No, Meador.
Hey there.
No, it's one of those. Give me your name correctly. So
it's Jeremy Meador. There
it is. Jeremy, thank you so much for coming on the show, and please forgive my inability to say names correctly. So this is really weird. It's kind of a weird, like I said, setup, because when you had your experiences, which initially had to do with ufology and things like that, were you on the hunt for this? And give a little bit of a background for those who aren't familiar with the stories of how you got into that.
Okay. Well, in 2003, I joined a group, or started a group, I guess you could say, with our two best friends and my brother, and we're called the Bigfoot's Pad Paranormal, and we're based out of Las Vegas. Well, we've been doing ghost hunting, and we do like a little bit of monster hunting, and we investigate mysteries, and we travel all over. We do that kind of stuff. But one day, around 2008, I was looking online for UFO stories to investigate, and I came across this story saying Ely, Nevada, in July of 1952. Or August of 52, sorry about that there was a crash, and it just had a number. It said 16 bodies in Ely, Nevada. Well, I started actually going on the hunt, I guess you would call it, looking for information on this, and that's what started this whole turn. Now I guess it turned out to be this year's 10 years that we've been looking for things in Ely.
Well, did it ever occur to you, like when you kind of almost fell across this in a way, that this would become a decade-long search? I know just in the time of things that I do and research and whatnot for stories and books and whatnot and all that, I love folklore. And more often than not, folklore is tied in with some event. There's always some little kernel of truth and, different mythologies and things like that. But when you kind of come across this, did you ever expect to sort of have this story to have the longevity, not just in that community, but in your own life?
No, not at all. Actually, when I started looking for stories, I actually didn't think we were going to find anything, but we ended up, by now, I guess we've talked to about 80 or 90 witnesses from about 5 or 6 different states, and now I am actually looking at moving to Ely sometime at the beginning of next year to continue researching this.
Wow, so you're like kind of taking Muhammad to the mountain, as it were. So, is that one of those things where obviously you've had to have a continuing relationship with the people in that area. And I'm sure, just like in a lot of communities that I visited and checked on stories and folklore and bizarre happenings, they kind of got to get to know you, and especially in small areas, it seems like you kind of got to put the time in. You really got to put in and show that you're not there just to sensationalize or mock the people. And how did they respond? Did it take a while for people to warm up, or were they very open to talk about it, or how did that all happen?
Well, actually, the people didn't want to talk to us at all when we first got there, because I mainly do the case with it's me and our friend Nick that mostly do it. But the two of us actually went to Ely 2 or 3 times and didn't get any stories, any new leads or any new stories at all. But my grandmother actually started working as a teacher in the next town over in Eureka, Nevada. And once I started mentioning that my grandma worked there, all of a sudden all of the people that we had talked to in the past that didn't know anything all of a sudden knew things, and they were opening up and talking to me because I had a connection with them, I guess, like you were saying. I know there has been news, I guess you'd call them, I won't call them news companies, news reporters, that's the word I was looking for. There's been the Las Vegas Review-Journal and some other newspapers and TV stations have come there looking for the story, but people won't talk to them, I guess, because they don't have an in with the community.
Right. Well, I mean, there's something. It's almost, and I say this, kind of tongue in cheek, but it's almost like a mob connection. Oh, I know a guy. He's a friend of a friend type of thing. Because, like you said, it seems like, especially as it gets closer to maybe the anniversary of something, or if it gets, okay, well, it's Halloween. Well, hey, let's go. We got to have a creepy story. We got to have a quirky story. Here, let's get one of the locals and camp them up and play Ghostbusters music if we can have it. And a lot of times, there's someone joking and laughing at the end of it. They don't take it with any sort of seriousness and give it any sort of the sort of proper treatment that it does. So a lot of times, it's one of those, haha, isn't that quaint type of stories. And like you said, once they can kind of get the cut of your jib and see, I don't even know if there's an expression they use anymore, but that's how old I am. But they kind of get an idea of who you are and sort of your character. And especially, like you said, you had the grandmother connection, and it's like,
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, well, this kid must be okay. Which, like you said, how old were you when you initially started trying to make contact with these folks?
I was actually like 18 or 19 when I first started it. Now I'm 28, so.
Wow. So were they sitting there like, man, who is this? Who is this kid? And what's he? What the 50s, like 1950s? He hears looking about a UFO. What's going on with this kid? Why aren't you out playing, PlayStation or something? Once they kind of welcomed you into the fold, as it were, is that when, like, and let me ask you a second, 2 things. Obviously, when they took you into the fold, that's when probably the deeper, less superficial elements of the story come out. I'm assuming that's when it's like, oh, well, most people don't know this, but is that when you really started to get to the meat of that situation?
Yeah, well, I made contact with 2 of the people that run museums in the town. Mm-hmm. And once I started talking to the 2 museum curators and the historians for White Pine County, I was featured in the Ely Times newspaper. And once I was put in the Ely Times newspaper, they put my contact information out there, and that's when I started getting calls from not just the 1952 copper mine UFO crash, but I also started getting stories about something that happened in northeastern Nevada over by Elko. And I started getting calls about something that happened in 1964 outside of Ely, and that's what actually led to the beginning of all these other cases.
Well, I know at least for my own thing, and it's so funny how similar and kind of mirroring these type of events get, especially if you're doing research. You get that foot in, and I always say, look, talk to. Say, like, who is the oldest person in your community, or do you have sort of an unofficial local historian, or if, like I said, if you have a museum, even better, or if you have someone who maybe even the mayor or whomever, go to somebody and kind of I'm always very upfront and tell them what I'm about, and they'll go, oh, well, here, call the library, or here, call retired sheriff, he was alive during that particular whatever. And more often than not, you come in there kind of with that, and as opposed to rolling in with a big crew and a big bright light in their faces, it seems like you get a lot more a lot more respect. Now you were saying there were other events that were kind of going on. Now, does it seem, and was this sort of like in a triangulated area, like so far away from each other, or?
Well, the majority of the events, I would say Ely, Nevada, for those of your listeners that don't know where Ely is, it's kind of in central eastern Nevada. I would say it's between central eastern Nevada. It's between, then there's Salt Lake, and then Boise, Idaho, and then you go down. So yeah, I guess you could say it's a triangle.
Okay.
That's where the majority of these cases happen.
Okay. Well, no, I wasn't trying to imply a UFO triangle, which, I mean, that's interesting if that's what's going on. That, I'm not sure necessarily the significance of it, but it seems like some of that sort of intersects, or at least, like you said, are sort of local. Now, how far are these areas from stuff like Area 51 and some of the other testing areas out there?
Well, Ely, Nevada is actually one of the most isolated towns in the lower 48. It's 3-hour drive to any major city, and the town of Ely actually has about 4,300 residents, but Area 51 is about an hour and a half, 2 hours away. And then the closest military bases, you have Hill Air Force Base in Ogden, Utah, which is about a 3.5-hour drive. Or you go to Nellis Air Force Base over in Las Vegas, and that's a 3.5-hour drive too. So the area of Ely, I guess you could say it's built on the side of a mountain, but it's kind of half wooded, half desert type scenery. And there are tons of copper and gold and silver mines in the area. One of the biggest copper mines in the country is actually there. It's called the Robinson Copper Mine, and that's only about 15 miles outside of Ely, and that is actually the focal point of where many of the UFO sightings start.
Well, that was the next thing I was going to ask you, and I was going to make one comment. Like I said, well, it's real close to that. Maybe they're seeing some experimental aircraft, or maybe some sort of off-budget whatever, but it seems like they would really have to go out of their way to do a flyover there. I mean, it seems like what is sort of happening there, be it terrestrial or extraterrestrial, doesn't necessarily seem connected to those bases. It seems like they got their own agenda going on.
Well, the original sightings actually happened in the 50s and the early 60s, and that's when Area 51 didn't exist, or they were just starting to build the runways there. But once you start hitting the 70s and the 80s, Area 51 was up and running, but you do start getting some stories that sound like they might be experimental craft, like humans made them, probably like I said in the 70s or 80s, but anything before that, I start saying it's mostly probably alien related.
Well, in the places that you were talking about in regards of where the contact was it was a crash, right? Or was it like a visitation, what they call it, a close encounters of the third kind type deal?
Well, there's two major ones in the area. The first one I'll tell you about, I'll give you like a quick rundown.
Sure.
And probably the date that's on the internet is 1952, but I think it was a little bit later than that, probably like 55 or 57. This is the story that's actually on the internet, but there's not a whole lot of information to support the story. But I did talk to about 5 or 10 people that actually contributed to the story. That's the only reason I didn't throw it out, actually. I guess in the winter of the mid 50s, I guess you would call it, during the late night graveyard shift, a glowing object crashed onto the snowbanks of one of these, I guess you would call them pits is what they call them. And the copper mine, the Robinson Copper Mine, has 3 major mining pits. And again, the mine is about 15 miles outside of Ely. So these people were mining in the middle of the night, and this object actually came and crashed on a snowbank. And according to what witnesses say, the object actually sat there for about 30 minutes to an hour before the mine security actually was sent out to go find out what this was. And the object was supposedly glowing purple, and it had yellow lights on it, and it was shaped like a disc. Well, when it crashed into the snowbank, what's that?
Well, I was just going to say, you would think that, my first thing was like, well, was it like a very heavy snow? Did it sink into it? I mean, or was it just...
Well, Ely actually snows... Ely's famous for having snow year-round. but they get some pretty heavy snowstorms where you'll get at least 1 or 2 feet of snow in like one night. Like it'll just blizzard status, I guess you'd call it.
Wow.
So from what I heard, I actually spoke to some workers that were working that night, and there was a haul truck driver, and he said that he was working in the Ruth pit, is what they call it, and he says that the object, when it hit the ground, he says that when security first arrived, they didn't know if it was a small plane that had crashed, or they didn't know if it was some kind of someone's toy, I guess you would call it, like a big kite, is what they were saying, because the helicopters were in their early infancy stages at this time, because the Korean War was just ready to start. He says that the object didn't break apart into a million pieces like you would think when it hit the ground. The snow kind of,
probably,
I guess, softened the blow.
Sure. Yeah,
so I guess they said that it kind of just hit there and sat there. He said that there was no openings or any windows or anything that they could see on it. And
well, I'm so sorry. I just interject. Something comes out of my head. I'm sorry. I apologize for that. I started to say I was surprised that they didn't try to say, "Oh, it's a weather balloon" or some sort of something like that. But you're saying did it appear to be almost seamless, like it was like a molded, like a one-piece molded type thing, like almost a formed thing, or
they said it looked like it was in like one single piece, almost like it was molded out of a machine or something like that. Like there was no tool marks, like no bolts, no screws, or nothing
seams,
like that.
Anything.
There was no seams on it.
Wow.
They said it did look like it was dripping wet, though, which is kind of a strange thing. They said it looked like if someone had sprayed it with a hose, and that it was, I guess, the word that I was told, I know it's not a real word, but liquidy was the word that they used. Like it was almost like slime from Ghostbusters, or what you would expect, like a runny, liquidy, goopy substance on the outside of it.
Well, I wonder if, I've heard of, good Lord, anybody that's, drove down a road, pretty much anywhere in the summertime, you would see kind of the mirage where it looks like like steam's coming off the ground and everything's wavery. I don't know if maybe that could have played into it, but you're saying it was actually running off of it. That's weird.
But it was running onto the snow, and what was weird was I guess you would call it some kind of like a liquid gel type substance. They said that it wasn't freezing when it was touching the snow and sitting in the snow, I guess.
Space slime. So it's almost like could it, this is all conjecture, maybe, transdimensional. Maybe did anyone spot it ripping through the skies before it crashed, or was it just like wham and it hit there?
Well, the original reports of the object crashing that actually came from some security guards that were driving on the opposite side of the mine, and there's a famous story online that you commonly see when you look up the Ely UFO crash. They say that there was a security guard that was working for Kennecott Copper Mine, which is who ran the mine at the time. They say that he was the only single witness to the event. Well, I actually contacted him. Well, he's deceased now, of course, but I talked to his 2 daughters up in Washington, and they connected me to some other workers, and that's when I put together this story of about, like, so I've personally talked to about 5 people that were there at the time, and then I've talked to probably about 10 people that were related to people that were there. So this object crashes in the snowbank, and the workers are gathering around it, trying to figure out what this is. Well, in the middle of all this happening, I would say probably within the hour or two, once it was noticed, whoever was running the mine called the Nevada National Guard unit that was stationed in Ely, and they, of course, called Hill Air Force Base in Ogden, Utah, and that's when the military started showing up. They blocked off. There's a town called Ruth that's actually at the base of this copper mine, and the entrance to the mine is right next to this little town. Well, the military blocked off the entrance to the town once the media started gathering, and they told the media that a small plane had crashed into this copper mine. And of course, at that point in time, they sent all the workers home, and they were telling everyone that it was a small plane. Well, the workers at this point in time had seen this object for an hour or two, so they knew that this wasn't a plane because they were staring at it face to face for at least an hour or two. And while the media and all the townspeople were gathering at the entrance to the mine, the workers picked up this UFO using a crane, and they put it on a flatbed trucks, and they took the object out the back entrance to the mine, which runs by an Indian reservation called Duckwater. Well, a lot of my stories come from the residents in Duckwater who saw the military vehicles with this object with a tarp driving through town. And apparently that they said that they weren't stopping at any stop signs. They were not following road rules, I guess you call it, the laws of the road. They were speeding like they were in a hurry. And meanwhile, the media was gathering in Ely, Nevada, on the other side of the mine, and they were being told a completely different story. Well, fast forward over the next couple days, military police actually were going door to door in Duckwater and in Ruth, Nevada, which is that town on the other side of the mine, and they were interrogating people, asking them what they had seen, and that's where the stories that you hear on the internet took place.
So this is where, obviously, damage control and obvious, finding out who knows what, suppression, probably have them do the gag orders, the whole, which, and also it's in that time of, look, our government, isn't going to lie to us. If they tell you not to say something, there's a reason for it, and it wasn't, people were maybe as jaded as they are now. I was wondering if any of the people who got up and had any sort of hands-on experiences with it, or at least standing within 3 or 4 feet of it, I wonder if any of these people developed any health issues after that, because you always hear about a lot of times about radiation from like ships and affecting people and affecting the crops where it lands. Did you get any reports of anybody having health issues?
Well, the only thing about that is the test site they were testing the atomic bombs that was only probably about an hour or two from Ely. And St. George, Utah, and Ely, Nevada got they have some of the most downwinders out of the whole country. So it's hard to tell whether they got cancer, if it was from that or if it was from them testing the bombs not that far away.
Wow. That really kind of throws me. Now you're saying when they were taking these guys out, they're like bats out of heck, just ripping through there. You would think that would be even more of an eye-catching thing if you're like trying not to draw attention, ripping, but through especially these small communities who really have probably very little traffic for the fact that they are so isolated. Now you said that you spoke to like people connected to like the reservations. Were there anyone that had, or any group of people that had like, well, look, this is maybe common in some of our folklore, some things like it, did it tie in with anything like that?
Well, at the time, helicopters didn't exist, so when they would see something hovering like that, the people at that time didn't think of helicopters as the first thing that came to mind. And when the people in the mine say they saw the object coming down, they thought that it was a plane. When I spoke to people on the Indian reservation, I guess you would call it the reservation. When I spoke to people on the reservation, they actually thought that it was a plane also. They didn't really relate it to any kind of folklore or things like that. I did get in contact with William McIntyre. He was actually there within a year or two after it happened. He was there on the scene talking to people. I guess you would call him the original investigator. And I got some of my stories from him. So I did a lot of homework when I was doing this. But other than that, the only thing that I know, I called a historian over at Hill Air Force Base and over at Nellis Air Force Base. And the Hill Air Force Base historian said that the incident was classified. He didn't say that it didn't happen. He said that it was classified. And he's told me that those types of crashes, the way he worded it, those types of crashes are classified. But if it did happen, we would have driven through Duckwater, took the craft to Hill Air Force Base, where we would have sent it out to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That's his exact quote. So he didn't say that it happened. He kind of,
like,
I guess,
let's hypothetically we would have done this. So it's sort of like this isn't what's going on, but this is kind of what happened. Now, something else I was going to ask you. Now, regards of, like you said, you're dealing with it that it's classified. Have you ever broached, the I'm blanking out, Freedom of Information Act, anything like that? Had you ever been able to contact somebody that might have, even if some of it is, marked out or whatever, blacked out? Have you been able to get anything from these guys that might touch on what they at least thought it was? Because this is the 50s. I would be thinking maybe they're thinking it's some sort of Russian, Cold War thing, a probe or whatnot.
Well, I haven't done a Freedom of Information Act request, but I have looked through hours and hours and hours of microfilm from different newspapers. I've looked at Project Blue Book, of course, and I've spoken to people that were there or people that are related to people that were there, and that's where the majority of my stories come from.
Well, and that's the thing that, especially when you talk to the folks, be it on phone or, however you do it these days, black and white can be interpreted or misinterpreted or misconstrued 100 different ways. You can generally kind of get that feel for if these people are being legitimate in their claims and how they carry themselves, and especially if somebody's like talking about a visitation or a contact, and you see that fear in their eyes, and you can kind of hear that heavy kind of breathing between it. You can kind of feel that they're reliving it, because anytime you retell that, you are reliving that, and there's a lot of times what you can't get out of a written report or a typed out report, because that's going to be, they're going to be, look, keep it as short, keep it as concise, very military, you know how it is working in corrections. It's like, look, man, just keep it simple, stupid. It was always that was the vibe we always got. But but yeah, it really seems that that was like a really major event there, and it seems like it. I mean, has it kind of continued? Has that sort of been a thing where the people still openly talk about it? Because there's been some places here, like in Western Kentucky and also in Eastern Kentucky, and where they have had visitations and whatnot. And like in Western Kentucky, they're pretty open about it. Now in Eastern Kentucky, it's taken a longer time to open up and kind of talk about it. Are these people kind of like, well, that's just a weird thing that happened, we just want to think about now, or do they kind of embrace it and make it part of the community?
A little bit of both. The younger people like to say that it doesn't exist or that it didn't happen, but when you talk to the like more middle-aged and older people, when you refer to the UFO crash, they automatically refer to that one. But then there's another one that happened back in between 62 and 64, and that was a little bit outside of Ely. That's the one where actually there are, I'm not even exaggerating, there are dozens and dozens of people that came to me with that story. So there's more witnesses I found for the 60s case than the 50s, but I'm not totally ruling out that neither one of them didn't happen.
Well, and I think too the fact of as times change and social mores morph into this and that, like you said, Cold War people, it's like, look, I'm not saying anything, loose lips sink ships and whatnot. And, by the time you're getting people that were raised in the 60s and the 70s, they were a little bit more like, well, we need to question this and that. We need to be able to be open about things like that. Was there anything in regards of this second that tied in with maybe the first, maybe like similar type ships found or anything like that?
Well, the story for the second one, I'll try to give you a quick rundown. I told you I was featured in the Ely Times looking for information on that first UFO crash I just mentioned. What's that?
No, I was listening to you. Go right ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I got information on the first. I was looking for information on the first incident, and I started getting calls for the second one. This other one, I actually talked to the guy who called me. He was the brakeman on the train that morning. He said it either happened at noon or around noon. He was on an ore train owned by the Nevada Northern Railway. It was coming from that copper mine that I told you in the other story, but this was further down the line. He said they came around a bend in the tracks around the side of a mountain, and he said that the tracks were torn apart and ripped up like pretzels, were his exact words. And he said that they had to hit the brakes really hard on the train to try to stop in time. And he said there was a partial derailment of some of the train cars in the front. And he says when they finally stopped, he said they looked off to the side, and you could see there was a large silver-looking object off in the distance that looked like it had came down from the sky, hit the tracks, bounced off, and landed at the bottom of a brush pile, he said. Well, so they ended up getting off the train, and he says while they were getting off the train and they were calling around trying to get a hold of dispatch to tell them that the tracks were damaged, that the train had derailed, they said that there were some female ranchers that lived on two ranches, and they rode out to the site, which I'll get to that in a second. So in the middle of all this happening, the ranchers are looking at this craft, and they're standing on top of it, and they're looking, trying to figure out what this object was. I guess they said that in the middle of all this, the ranchers rode off, and after the ranchers rode off, they said that, again, that same National Guard unit from Ely came up, the Nevada 9th National Guard to be exact. They came up and they took all the people off of the train and they brought them to the Ely jail. And at the jail is where they were interrogated by the National Guard. And meanwhile, while this is going on, reinforcements came from Hill Air Force Base to go, I guess, cordon off the area. Well, part of recovering the craft, they brought a large wrecking crane from the Ely, Nevada railroad station. It's actually now a museum, and the crane is still there nowadays. What? They took this, it was a rail crane, so it was brought on like a train. They brought this, what's that?
I was just going to say, wasn't this at the time one of the biggest in the U.S.?
Oh, sorry.
I believe, was that not correct?
It was, yeah, well, that was the biggest crane in the county and one of the biggest cranes in the country at that time.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was thinking.
It's run by a steam engine. So now that I actually went and saw the exact crane, it's on display and it's all restored and everything. It's really cool looking. So anyway, so this crane arrives on the scene and it picks up the UFO. I was told it picked up the UFO out of the brush, and they said that they put this thing onto a flatbed, and then they brought it to Hill Air Force Base. Well, meanwhile, I'll go back to these two ranchers that I was told. I talked to the son of one of the ranchers, and he said that these two ladies actually picked up pieces of it off the ground. This one actually did ripped a big hole in the side, and there was, I guess you would call it, green glass-like debris, I was told, was all over the desert. And these women picked up some of it. And one of the ladies still had some in a box, but the son wouldn't tell me if I could look at it or not, and he got kind of scared and freaked out when I started asking him about it. But from what I know, he said that it looked like green glass. And I guess he was a little kid at the time, and he was actually living on one of those ranches, and he was watching from a distance when all this was going, when the mom rode out to the site. Well, he was told by his mom that the craft actually had some kind of hieroglyphics, is what he called it, written on one of the sides. And this one, again, it was seamless, and he said that it appeared silver on the outside, but he said when his mom looked inside, it looked like it was almost like night vision, how it's like black and green.
Weird.
Okay, so I heard that story. So I also talked to some of the guardsmen on that day, and they said that when you stepped inside this thing, he said it looked like night vision, like I was stating. He said it looked like night vision, where you couldn't tell that it was the middle of daylight or nighttime. It just looked like night vision, I guess, what he compared it to. And he said one of the guys I talked to said he stepped in the UFO and he thought he was in there for like 15 or 20 minutes, but when he stepped out, he was actually in there for a few hours, he said. So I thought that was kind of weird.
So it almost seems like it had its own sort of like quantum field or something, to use sort of a half-hind in layman's term. It almost had its own little pocket universe, almost like going on that through the laws of time or as what we think of as laws of time. Now I wonder if the glass shards or whatever, I wonder if that could have been part of a bigger array. You've heard a lot of times they talk about crystalline structures, and which I know in like some of the early things that they found, like at Roswell, they talked about a lot of, there's no circuit boards, just lines running, which would sound to me like fiber optic cable, and that's such a strange story. Well,
they said it looked like it was silver on the outside, but they said when you would step inside it, that it looked like it was green, and the inside looked completely different than the outside. But they said there was no windows on the outside, but when you stepped inside, you could see a 360-degree view of the desert all around you.
Huh. That's extremely weird. I mean, I know. Well, you know how they just now got to the point where they discovered, or not discovered, I guess made clear aluminum, kind of like in the old Star Trek stuff. They were something like, well, how can you see through all this? Oh, well, it's it's metal, but you can see through it. And I wonder how far we're off from having that, or maybe do you think maybe they've bioengineered it at this point that we might actually have some of that in our arsenal at this point?
That is weird. I don't think whatever this was man-made, because, like I said, there's a lot more information supporting this story. Another good point I wanted to make, though, was I went to the Nevada Northern Railway Museum, and I went to the archives a couple different times. We actually found documentation of a train leaving Ruth, Nevada, full of ore, was headed towards Shafter, Nevada, which is like a railway station up there. And there was documentation of a train leaving, but it didn't arrive where it was supposed to be going. And they mentioned that there was a partial derailment outside of Ely at a specific mile marker that the brakeman told me. And they said that the boxcars were actually taken apart by a railway crane, and the same crane that took the boxcars apart so that it could get to a certain point in the line, right. They said that it was used for an undisclosed reason, which I think was to pick up the UFO, because the area that this happened in, there's a big ditch full of water next to where the old tracks are, and the UFO crashed on, I guess you call it settled on the other side of this ditch. So they would have had to have used this crane to pick it up, carry it over the ditch, and put it on the crane, or put it on the flatbed, sorry.
Well, it does seem like there's a lot of, there's nothing to see here elements going on with that, and sort of a misdirection and a lot of damage control.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in some of the time that we've got left, did you want to talk at all about, some of the kind of backlash from some of your investigations on it? Because I know you'd mentioned having supposedly people from government bodies speak to you about some of your investigations.
Oh, yeah, well, I was actually on a couple different radio shows probably around 2010 or 2012, and I mentioned that I was given a piece of physical evidence from that 1950s crash that I told you about. And the day after I mentioned this, I was working graveyard shift at a casino at the time, so I came home from work and I pulled into the driveway, and I was getting ready to go inside, and I had one or two legs were sitting outside the car at the time, and before I could even get out of the car, it looked like a white van. It tore in the neighborhood, parked behind me, almost like in a T shape, so I couldn't back in or I couldn't back out. Mm-hmm. And a guy got out in a military fatigue, and he started questioning me on the UFO crashes, and he started asking me questions about who I was and things like that. But when he got out of the car, he already knew my name. He knew where I worked. He knew my friend Nick that does the UFO crashes with me. He knew about him. He knew about our college that we were in at the time. He knew like everything about us. And what was weird was after the conversation, he told me that to tell Nick that he said hi. And I thought that was really strange. So I tried calling Nick, and I didn't hear from Nick for a few months after that, because I don't know what they told him. He still won't tell me to this day. But they told him something that scared him pretty bad.
Yeah, it's definitely sounded like they were. No, I was just starting to say it definitely sounded like they were flexing on you guys a little bit.
Oh yeah, well I took a picture of the van when it was driving away, and I put it online right after it happened. But what's weird was, I've actually, around that time, I saw the same white vans coming around the house probably about 4 or 5 times around that time frame. And I did have calls from Hill Air Force Base, Douglas Air Force Base, and Nellis Air Force Base were calling my house phone at that point in time, trying to get a hold of me, which was another strange thing, because I had spoken to the historians at Hill Air Force Base and at Nellis, but this was something totally different that they were calling me about.
Right. And this is the picture, I believe, that you'd sent me with the white van out in front of the brown two-story.
Yeah.
Is it okay if I was to say put this up on my page to show people that they can see this after the fact?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, well, I always like to get permission before I do that. And people can see that at steveeasher.com, and that'll be later this afternoon when that'll be up. Well, let me ask you this, because like I said, we've probably got 4 minutes left. is there any other things that you want to touch on? And like I said, we could do this for 4 hours, and I'd hope to have you back and discuss a little bit more of this in more detail and some of the other subjects. Is there some other things you want to touch on real quick before we fade out?
Well, I do ghost hunting and monster hunting and things like that, but since the show we're mostly talking about UFOs, it seems, for this specific segment, one thing I did want to mention was there are stories relating to creatures on the ground that I guess you could say look like aliens. There's stories about lights in the sky even up to this day. There's stories about objects landing in the copper mine. Like, I have some good stories about early government crafts that actually had to crash land, I guess you would say emergency land, in that copper mine. And I know for a fact that some of those were government, and I could explain that on another show. But there's a lot of strange UFO activity in that specific area of Nevada for some reason. I don't exactly know why. I think it has something to do with the mines for sure. Because it seems like that specific copper mine is where like the origins of a lot of these stories come from.
Yeah, my gut tells me that I think, like you said, there's more going on with that. And, you know, those mines very well could interconnect with a whole lot of different things. I'm sure you've heard of like the DUMBs, the deep underground military bases and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, there's conspiracy theory that those run all throughout the Southwest and crisscross the country, actually. So who knows? You know, who knows what's down there? That could be one of the kind of nexus points where they come in and out or whatever. It definitely seems like there's some reason that the traffic there is so heavy.
Well, there's stories about the tailing ponds in the mines, and they said that they see lights coming in and out of the tailing ponds at nighttime because they're not constantly mining in all three of those pits at the same time. So they'll be working on, say, the pit on the far left, and they'll see on the far right, they'll see lights in the water at nighttime, but it'll be pitch black because there'll be no one working over there. And they said they'll see lights, colored lights coming under the water and coming in and out, going into the sky, which is really weird.
Yeah, that has to be that. And you plan on moving there? This is
If I plan on moving there at probably December or January, I'll be living there.
Wow. Well, you're definitely going to have your hands full, you know, especially if it's as active as you say. You know, like I said, being in West Kentucky, there's oddball things here too, and you know, it's like everywhere. You know, we have a very large area called the Land Between the Lakes, and there's stories of dogmen and, you know, UFO encounters and Bigfoot, and in those deep woods and those kind of isolated areas seem to be hotbeds for that type of activity. But what I'd like to do here in a minute, I'm getting ready to fade this down, and I appreciate you being on, Jeremy, and I gotta have you back on. There's so much stuff. We just barely hit the tip of the iceberg on this. And,
definitely.
And you always want to leave them wanting more, and I know they're going to want to hear more about this because I've had a lot of people ask me. It's like, oh, you know, find out about that, and likes to talk about the, you know, the Ely thing, and I'm like, yeah, I'll do it. But so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cue up my fade out music right about now. And what I want to do is I want to make sure to tell everybody I appreciate them tuning in to House of Asher. And like I said, you can find us on my page, stevieasher.com, YouTube, Spreaker, also on WPKY 103.3, your hometown radio station and the home of Tiger football. I want everyone to enjoy the rest of the day, get out there and enjoy all those woods and all that fun time. But as it gets late and the shadows grow long, I want you to make sure to come home and secure your doors and windows. Look under your bed, look in your closet. You never know, there might be a little green guy floating around in there, or even worse, there might be one of the men in black outside wanting to see if you might have had an encounter recently. But I want you guys to remember to love one another, love yourselves, and until next time, stay scared, everybody.